Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, June 18th, 2018. That's a couple of 18s. Good for your lottery picks, just in case you haven't got those in. You might as well. It's time to try to build an instant fortune and head underground and build yourself an armed bunker that you can use to achieve real freedom in the new world order. Just thought I'd throw that one out there for you. It's a little difficult to contemplate on a Monday morning. Hey, maybe your coffee hasn't kicked in just yet, but it's time for you to try and build a compound in a foreign land like Eric Prince so that you can experience true freedom in the Trump era. It's not for all of us anymore. Collective action is not going to do it. You're going to have to make it on your own. That's the new value for those of us living under the Trump so-called administration. I know that wasn't exactly where we intended to go. We have plenty to cover today. Thousands of children still imprisoned along the borders of the United States. Hooray, we're doing great as a country. Yes, obviously, everyone's going to be talking about that. I am looking at the moment for a video clip that I saw over the weekend, and I think I retweeted it at some point. I want to see if I can't come up with that one. I think it was just yesterday. An interesting clip from, I think, the final debate that may have been in, I don't know, Las Vegas. Is that correct? Just another of those strange clips in which Hillary Clinton tells you exactly what's going to happen under a Trump administration should he be elected, and he spends that time huffing, snorting, sniffling, shouting wrong, along with her as she basically outlines exactly what's happening on the immigration front. There it is, as a matter of fact. I don't think there's any sniffs and snorts and wrongs in this particular clip, but it's only a minute and a half long. So remarkable restraint shown by Trump during that minute and a half. But yeah, pretty much says you elect this guy and his platform for immigration. What this platform means is tearing children away from families. It means having an immigration police force skulking throughout the country, breaking down doors at places of business and making off with the workforce. It means patrolling the halls of schools, looking for anybody who might potentially be undocumented. It means all of the things that they said were going to happen and which Trump rolled his eyes, snorted, and shook his head and shouted wrong about. And why he did that, I'm not really sure. I mean, didn't his base... Shouldn't we have been told at the time that his base was cheering for that rather than looking to duck responsibility for that? Certainly there was somebody in one of their bars or diners who could have told us that. Anyway, just sort of a nice flashback. And, that doesn't necessarily mean she was the world's greatest anything. It just means, I don't know, she said it was true. And as the person I was actually retweeting pointed out, in this case, Eric Boehlert, saying, yeah, well, she wasn't authentic, said a bunch of pundit dudes, and it is all rather sad. But hindsight being 2020, mine being somewhat worse than that, and it's time for me to go in to see if my prescription has changed. Perhaps tomorrow. Time to get some new glasses. Well, anyway, it's all very discouraging, and we're going to try and make it through. We'll cling to one another with the best news or the best spin that we can possibly put on the news. Anyway, plenty collected in pocket for today. Plenty already collected by Greg Dworkin in his list on Skype. And thumbs up from Justice. All appears to be going well. So we'll set our alarms and look straight ahead and try and push forward here. There's plenty to get to. By the way, lots of steam being picked up on the idea of sanctioning Trump. We spoke, I think, last week about the fact that people in Parliament in Canada, as we like to call it, had picked up on the idea as well. It seems to have broken through. I don't know if it was necessarily my tweet to Justin. I've lost Greg on this one. So we must have had a bad connection. I didn't mean to refer to the Canadian Prime Minister on first name basis, Justin Trudeau. I don't know that it was my tweet to him that that caught their attention. Although I do think that there was plenty that went on that caught their attention just fine. And then, of course, how many times do I have to hit this button to make it work? There we are. Let's switch over now and see if Greg is with us. Is this connection working better for you, Greg?
It is.
All right. Was the last one not? I didn't even get a chance to ask.
It was staticky for some reason.
All right.
So I redid it.
Well, it was me on the line with Justin Trudeau telling him it's time to sanction Trump, and he was saying, yes, I know, I saw you on Twitter and or read the Houston Chronicle or our own Canadian Maclean's magazine, and that could have been it too.
Canadians. Let's see. They're the guys that rescued our hostages in Iran. I'm old enough to remember that.
Yes, still dining out on that on Canada, but thank you. It was a big deal. I'm not kidding.
Pretty good hockey players, too.
Yes, so it would seem. I mean, you know. Okay, I mean, they didn't win the 1980 Olympic gold medal or anything. Yeah, and as long as we're dining out on 1980, I can do it too, you know.
So the whole thing here about what's happening today is an incredible amount of fierce blowback on the abusive Trump immigration politics and, of course, the lying about it. And it's really kind of remarkable. The pundit roundup that I had today quoted a bunch of sources, but let me just give you an idea that the New York Times, both parties pushed Trump to halt family separations, and in fact it is both parties. What's interesting is when they talked about Melania Trump's comments.
Yeah, right, sure. She's commenting all the time.
The bipartisan push came as Melania Trump made a rare public intervention, echoing the president's false claim that a political stalemate was to blame. So they did mention that she said something, but they also mentioned she was lying about it. What was even bigger is the lie that came from Kirstjen Nielsen, who basically claimed against all information, including her own interview back in May, that there was no policy about separating parents and children, period. Which is, of course, that formulation is what Sean Spicer said about the inauguration. The inauguration was the biggest ever, period.
Right.
So that means it was dictated to her, and she wrote it.
Well, she may have written it down herself. That would be show some initiative. Yeah, this is all evidence to the contrary. And I mean, it's possible she's hanging her hat on, well, it doesn't say at the top of the paper, policy. It's something that was directed, and we did it.
Stephen Miller took credit for the policy. That doesn't exist.
Oh, okay. Well, there's that. I did see a clip this morning of John Kelly, while he was still Homeland Security Secretary, insisting that was going to be the policy going forward and that he was pushing for it. But
and she's his handpicked successor.
That is correct.
You like Melania, you can take various degrees of opposition, but among the opposition to this include Franklin Graham, Kellyanne Conway, Cardinal Dolan. The only people supporting it are Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon. In other words, the Nazis like it.
I guess so.
And Laura Bush came out with a editorial against this, and as Peter Wehner pointed out, she never opposes anything on policy. It's the first time she's ever done that.
All the first ladies are out.
The pundit roundup has all of those things, including a nice quote by John Weaver, who is Kasich's old advisor. I have an idea, he said. Take these kids out of these cages and return them to their parents, and then put the Trump administration in the cages.
Hey,
all of them.
I agree. That's a pretty good one.
But stepping back, U.S. Catholic bishops escalated the criticism. It's coming from all sides. Mark Murray actually summed it up today. He said Republicans and conservatives in varying ways break from Trump on migrant family separation, including a weird one from Susan Collins. I oppose what they're doing, but I oppose doing anything about it.
Well, that's
Senator
Collins.
Lindsey Graham, House Speaker Paul Ryan, Laura Bush, of course, and Franklin Graham I've already mentioned. The conservative New York Post, stop breaking up families at the border. And the New York Post editorial is actually pretty scathing. Oh. And it says, we recognize that returning to the policy of 2 months back creates some perverse incentives. Bring kids along, you'll just be deported if you're caught. But at least switching back avoids having the U.S. government earning comparisons to the Nazis. If the president doesn't want to admit defeat, he can just add this to the long list of things he blames on Jeff Sessions. trying to tough this one out is guaranteed disaster. Advice to Trump. I'll tell you what I wrote about it this morning. I said, for those who think this Trump policy of torturing children by separating them from their parents is working politically, read on, because it ain't. Trump administration is being compared to the Japanese World War II internment, early moves in Nazi Germany, and there's an election coming.
How could you not?
The bigged problem here is that people have in their heads about Nazis is that they were some kind of mythical super evil, like the Balrogs in Lord of the Rings, wreathed in shadow and flame. They weren't. They're apparatchiks like Stephen Miller. As Hannah Arendt wrote, banal enforcers of horrible policy. She was writing about the Eichmann trial in Israel. They were people like Susan Collins who don't see enough wrong with it to stop it by supporting a democratic bill. There was a term used for non-members of the Nazi Party in Germany who looked the other way and allowed things to happen. They were called Nazis. And no, it's not hyperbole. It's exactly how it went down, again, referring to Arendt's description of the Eichmann trial. That's why the Trump White House has to lie about the policy, claiming Democrats did it and that it would take legislation to fix. Then none of that is true. Or that it doesn't even exist, like Kirstjen Nielsen claimed. But neither are true. Trump did it because he wants to, and Stephen Miller affirmed it was deliberate. So do not capitulate on this. Trump thinks that he can force Democrats to the table by basically abusing children. And the American Academy of Pediatrics says it's abuse. Said that this morning.
All right.
Kirstjen Nielsen needs to resign, and Stephen Miller needs to be fired, and the media needs to step up its coverage.
I'd say. Yes.
Margaret Sullivan has a really nice piece on this about how to deal with Trump lies. And basically what she says is you have to do a truth sandwich. This was George Lakoff's formulation.
Really?
You put the context. Children are being put in cages and taken away from their parents. And then you can quote whatever Trump says about it. He says we're not doing it. And then you fact check and says, well, actually he is. So everything that Trump said, you don't just repeat a Trump tweet. Trump says he's not doing something. Trump lies and then repeat it. That's not how the media ought to approach this. First you do the context, then you can say what the Trump administration claims, and then you fact check it. That's the proper way to approach all this crap. And that's actually happening with a lot of this. I have a ton of examples of people actually pointing out in the media that Trump's lying about this.
Well, it's good that people are pointing this out. It is happening, but yes, it's not changing anything just yet, and we may have to wait for it.
I got other stuff on that too. Axios says, be smart. We know that Trump is responsive to traumatic images, including kids being gassed in Syria, because he reads at the level of a fifth grader, and seeing pictures is important to him.
If you put it on television, it might work.
And he's acutely attuned to how issues play in the media, so some well-wired Republicans think he may eventually find a way to change policy announced by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Trump is expected to be personally confronted on the issue when he's the guest for a special meeting of House Republicans tomorrow evening. Multiple sources in close touch with the White House believe this issue is providing images that fuel the left's worst views of the administration. That is to say, they're showing him and us and everybody else that we were right. Yeah. But sources say Trump views the issues as leverage and will try to get funding for a border wall or other concessions for a rollback of the policy. Now, Dave Drucker, who's a conservative reporter for the Washington Examiner, points out that Trump does a lot of misplays because he doesn't really understand his opposition. He thinks he can force them to the table by doing that. It didn't work with DACA, and that's why that fell apart. The Democrats are limited, remember, they're shut down in terms of what they can do about it. But Matt Fuller, who's a very good congressional correspondent, says that his sources are telling him that there's probably 300 to 400 votes in the House to fix this now, and it might even come up this week. That people on the Republican side are really upset about this because they think they're getting clobbered by this politically.
They may be, and they may even be upset about it too. But we'll see. I mean, we've been over similar territory. I mean, this one may be a little. Some things work, some things don't. Yeah,
this is much more.
Try it again, no doubt, no doubt about it. We just went through there are enough votes, and then here's a mechanism by which you can force yourself past the leadership. The votes disappeared.
Yeah, but it may come up again.
Yeah, don't
Axios
stop.
Says, Republicans tell us with midterms approaching and the border is becoming a transcendent story, administration efforts to blame Democrats and parse the policy could become unsustainable. That's what they're telling Axios, and Axios is a pretty Trump-friendly site.
Yeah, relatively speaking, sure.
So is the New York Post.
Yeah, don't drop it because it hasn't worked, or even if it's true that it won't. The point is it at least at a minimum perpetuates the story and sets the contrasts, and gives lie to the claim that both sides really want to do something.
Right, which perhaps they do if they're forced to, at least one of the sides.
Maybe. Hey,
you have
could
medical
be all right about
professionals
that.
also calling out the administration on this. In fact, one pediatrician who lives in D.C. says he's legally required to call Child Protective Services on the Trump regime because this is child abuse.
Go ahead. Yeah, good. And share the number.
Right. Kevin Ryan, I led New Jersey's child welfare system. I've advised 5 federal judges on the reform of child-serving systems across the U.S. If any of these systems ever forbid staff from touching or soothing a sobbing toddler in a crisis, I'd urge leadership and courts to shut it down. Shut it down.
Well, in New Jersey, they've got some place that could cause, might create a legal obligation for them to call as well. There was lots of news report about the detention center in Elizabeth, New Jersey.
Yep.
So they are everywhere, and I guess everyone will have reason to call their local authorities.
John McCormick, who writes at the Weekly Standard, was retweeting a Doubthout comment, Russ Doubthout, separating children from their parents at the southern border, delivering them into a bureaucratic labyrinth while their fathers and mothers await trial or petition for asylum is the wickedest thing Trump administration has done so far. With the subheading, we need ways to control migration, but the separation of families shows us how not to do it. So there's a lot of pressure on the conservative side as well as the Democratic and progressive side, as well as just like normal people side to do something. So I think this is different than a lot of the other policies that have come up. Of course, we have a poll on this. There's a new poll out.
Sure.
This is from the Daily Beast, an Ipsos poll. Nearly every day, voters have been confronted with heart-wrenching stories about immigrant children being separated. It was especially poignant on Father's Day from their parents upon crossing the border. The president incorrectly blames his administration's policy on Democrats. That's how you frame, how you report what Trump said, not just repeating it, but just, pointing out it's from the beginning. It's not right.
Yeah.
So the poll of roughly 1,000 adults 18 and over, conducted June 14-15, asked respondents if they agreed with the following statement. It's appropriate to separate undocumented immigrant parents from their children when they cross the border in order to discourage others from crossing the border illegally. 27% said yes, 56% said no. Republicans leaned slightly more in favor, with 46 agreeing and 32 disagreeing. They didn't even hit 50 on that.
So
14% of Democrats and 29% of independents. And, of course, independents are the key in all of this. Yeah. Republicans cannot win elections by themselves. They have to recruit independents.
Yes, that's true. I mean, we certainly have every reason to believe it's true, even if it doesn't feel that way sometimes.
No, it is true.
Yeah, well.
Let's see what else we have. Also, the Washington Examiner is reporting that the U.S. could be holding as many as 30,000 border kids by August because they want to ramp everything up.
Yes, right. They're actually, that's true. Over the weekend, the administration let it be known that their reaction to this was that they could double the number of families separated. Exactly the reaction all the Republican electeds were hoping for.
Right. And so, you could see Republicans scramble. You can see Fox News scramble. This is great. This is this morning. Steve Doocy says on Fox and Friends, I think it's Fox and Friends that he's on, the authorities aren't building cages. They're building walls out of chain link fences. Yes,
right. Of course. I see a lot of that. And of course, when you can speak to his base about that and tell them they all need to get their money back from the WWE every time they show up and pay extra to see a cage match, they've been duped.
Well, the two things, Atros had a funny tweet. He said, no, these aren't cages. They're luxury open plan condominiums, which I took him to task for because by saying that, they'll probably now start charging monthly user fees.
Well, it's certainly a condo fee. Trump loves those.
But what's interesting is that the Doocy quote is being tossed around on right-wing media. I see all these conservatives tweeting it back saying, this is stupid.
Yeah, well, Doocy is stupid. I mean,
it is. What I'm saying is that if you reduce to this as your defense, you're not winning.
I hope not. But you are the administration, and that's sad.
Right. So I think that all of that is playing poorly. They're simply getting clobbered. I mean, there's no other way to put it. And I just don't see how they can sustain and maintain their current stance. They've managed to rally the entire country, including conservative religious groups, against them.
Yes. And that's it. That is good news. And I'm glad the Catholic bishops in particular have been vocal. And as you said, Franklin Graham, which I don't really want to give him too much credit for anything, but it was nice to see. Catholic bishops, of course, they're sensitive about what happens to children these days.
Mark Murray also points out many of the GOP voices haven't quite acted on the criticism. Think Susan Collins. But Republicans breaking from Trump has hurt the president's standing in the past, and he uses as examples the initial travel ban, Charlottesville, the Comey firing, the Arpaio pardon, and the health care debate each time Trump's standing took a hit in the polls. And I'm thinking that's probably going to happen here, too.
Okay.
It's just the voices are just too loud and the images are just too great to ignore.
Well, all right. I won't ignore them.
Mm-hmm. So how is everything else playing out? I mean, this isn't the only thing that's happening in the country.
Yeah, but
there's a very interesting piece that Josh Grashower had in the National Journal yesterday called The GOP's Rapid Retreat in the Midwest.
I see.
Subheading, Republicans have abandoned Senate races in states Trump carried and could lose several key governorships as well. Trump's boasting of crashing the blue wall is rapidly becoming ancient history. Mm-hmm. Now, it's partially a question of his tariffs and the fact that soybean prices are really getting hit as well. He's hitting Iowa farmers, and they're not happy about it. In fact, Des Moines Register over the weekend had a huge blaring headline about, Trump tariffs going to, cause X amount of dollar damage to the state.
Yeah.
So people are very, very aware that things aren't going their way. But the way that you see it is in people who earlier in the year were thought to be possibly targets for Republicans to pick off, no longer targets. Tammy Baldwin, Bob Casey, Debbie Stabenow, Sherrod Brown. The Republicans aren't thinking they're targets anymore, and the Democrats aren't even spending a lot of money defending them.
Okay.
And in fact, not only does Sherrod Brown have a pretty big lead, but Mike DeWine, the Republican Attorney General establishment figure, who was expected to be the favorite, is in fact trailing in 2 polls to Richard Cordray over the weekend.
Okay.
So the whole environment in the Midwest, which Trump sees as a key part of his base, after all, it's Wisconsin, and Michigan and Pennsylvania who elected him.
Right. That's all he knows.
He's ignoring him.
Well, okay. He ignored him the first time, and they went over his way anyhow, because whatever reason, he bought them. I don't know. But
political movements in Ohio headed in the opposite direction from Trump. Trump's job approval in the state is 43, with 54 disapproving, according to a new Quinnipiac survey. Half the respondents who a Suffolk University poll of Ohio voters said the midterm vote would be a check on the president, compared to 28% saying their vote would be to support Trump's agenda. Uh-huh. And Sherrod Brown now holds a commanding double-digit lead over Jim Renacci in the latest public polls, Democrat Richard Cordray inching ahead of DeWine. These results should be alarming to Republicans, Kraushauer, the conservative, writes, who were hoping to hang on to Trump's unconventional coalition for the presidency over the long haul. These Midwestern states feature a disproportionate share of those famed Obama-Trump voters. A lot of them are older, who many Democrats feared would move permanently into the Republican column, even as Trump is shamelessly trying to win them back by implementing tariffs on steel and aluminum and fighting polarizing culture wars. Many are defecting back towards the Democrats for this year's midterms. The growing economy and shrinking unemployment rate aren't enough to keep them in the fold. The tax cuts wasn't enough. And this is going to be pushing them in the other direction toward the Democrats. It's also a blow to congressional Republicans, hoping to limit their losses to the Republicans representing diverse suburban constituencies, which is really where the key is.
Yes, and they're losing their grip there, and that's good news.
There's a reason Democrats are encouraging their candidates to focus on the economic anxieties many Americans still feel despite the macroeconomic boom. Healthcare is now polling as the top issue among voters, driven by middle-class Americans worried about rising expenses for medical care. Trump may be shattering traditional Republican economic dogma, which was a farce anyway. But his blunt force approach to politics isn't convincing his newfound fans to vote for his adopted party. And Politico has a pretty good story we can get in before the break. It's not that long.
All right.
About just how orthodoxy has been disrupted. Republicans give up on Medicare overhaul.
What? Okay.
Well, because of the tax cuts, Medicare is in more trouble than it was. You'd think that Paul Ryan and the rest of the Republicans would turn around and say, you see, we told you, now we have to cut entitlements. There's no appetite for that in the Republican Congress.
Oh, well, he's checked out.
Well, but the entire Congress was devoted to this, not just him.
But they are morons.
They don't want to have an argument with Trump about it, and Trump said, I'm not doing it.
Oh, well, yeah, he did say that. I don't know how long that lasts, but okay.
The quiet surrender on a subject that's energized GOP fiscal costs for the better part of a decade comes as new projections show Medicare's trust fund in its worst shape since the recession. That's left conservatives unsure how to agitate because it's a politically unpopular thing to overhaul Medicare, and President Donald Trump detests it. And it raises new questions about who will take up the entitlement reform mantle as Ryan heads for the exit. They don't know what to do. They're totally in disarray.
Yeah.
So somehow it's the Democrats' fault. And that way you can write about it as Democrats in disarray.
Right. And also both sides or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. What box will Republicans campaign out of once Paul Ryan's box is retired? We're not sure.
We're the White People's Party.
Well, yeah, that's a good backup. That's true, and a lot of them use Medicaid. So I suppose that could have a lot to do with it. All right, so good. I'm glad they're giving up on a few of these things that are horrible, one at a time. I suppose can't hold our breath on all of them. I can hold our breath for 2 minutes though. Hang on. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring, monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back, everybody, to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Greg Dworkin still with us, still sharing information, breaking up to the moment. I can't tell from this if Trump is awake or not, but we'll check in on this. This is Trump often campaigning in Germany all of a sudden somehow. How did this?
The headline is from The Independent from Britain. Trump attacks Angela Merkel for giving sanctuary to refugees. U.S. president claims migration has strongly and violently changed European culture. He's parroting Stephen Bannon, who was over there agitating for the same things.
Okay.
But we'll set that aside for the moment. A couple other tweets to read you because I think they're of interest. This is John Harwood. First Lady Melania Trump weighs in on migrant family separation at the U.S.-Mexican border in a statement. Harwood says this is not a both-side situation, contradicting the First Lady. And Michael Freeman, who is a Republican strategist and a never-Trumper, says, Office of First Lady Melania Trump issued statement on migrant family separations. And as to that statement, he says what I said. The White House knows it's losing the PR war on this, thus inserting the First Lady with a misleading statement. The funny thing is, her words are not going to be taken the way the White House intended. They meant it to be, it's a both sides thing. And the public is taking it as even Melania hates you.
Yes.
And hates your policy.
Right. And that may be true, but I don't know, it matters a great deal, but it's interesting to watch. And they think they can use her as a tool every once in a while. So, and
they
magically,
think they can use everybody,
up,
but it's part of their
true.
Miscalculation.
Right. Every once in a while when she shows up in public, it's miraculously to say exactly the same thing. And that shouldn't surprise anybody, of course, as between presidents and first ladies. That's true. That's not.
And this just in from CBS this morning. Border Patrol has reached out to CBS this morning and said they're very uncomfortable with the use of the word cages. They say it's not inaccurate and added that they may be cages, but people are not being treated like animals.
No. Why? Except, right, minus the cage thing.
But, there are also pictures of 2-year-olds with sneakers where they've taken the shoelaces.
Yes.
So that the kids don't hang themselves,
The 2-year-olds.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I guess there's no point in giving them shoelaces. They can't tie their shoes. However, yeah, that's depressing. They also can't tie nooses, but neither can anybody else who's in the cages with them, which aren't cages. So
right. There are people down in the facilities, workers there who are quitting, who are saying we're not prepared for this. We don't have enough staff for this. And they mention in passing that, not only are there incredible needs for the kids, but some of them are attempting suicide.
That is
amazing. This is major league bad stuff.
Yeah. I don't know what to tell people to do.
I'm telling you, there is no way the White House is going to be able to sustain this policy. Not going to happen.
Well, I hope not. And, I don't know what to say to the people who are working. I don't know whether – I'm not 100% thrilled by necessarily I think I know what they mean. I'm quitting because we don't have enough staff to do this job properly and take care of people the way they need to be taken care of, as opposed to, well, I quit because there aren't enough of us to, around to split the workload of abusing people evenly. That can't be.
Somebody, made the very good point over the weekend, which I think is worth considering, that it's really not a good idea to blame the shelters, because the alternative to the shelters is even worse. It's the policy that puts the kids in the shelters, not what the shelters are doing.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know who to. Yeah, I don't know. What is the alternative to the shelters exactly? I'm not sure.
Well, you can sell the kids.
They may be. I don't know. This raises a question. I did see somebody tweet something on this front earlier, and it's the kind of thing that you say, well, that can't we know things are terrible, but that can't really be the reality. But have you seen anything? Every story I've seen where they get into these centers and they describe what's going on, they describe seeing 6,000 to 10,000 boys of various ages, and somebody has been tweeting,
where are the girls, where are the infants, and they won't answer. Right,
and there's no answer. And there are so many terrible answers already floating around in the world that we're all pretty sure. We read it in the news. We're pretty sure it's all true, and presumably it is with respect to other countries. When girls go missing in other countries, we don't have much doubt about what has happened to them, and we, I guess, don't want to contemplate that happening here in the United States. And you say, well, that's do you have any proof of that? I don't. But where are they? And they won't show you. And it would be 100 times worse, I guess, if, say, Donald Trump had been implicated in, trafficking in young girls in the past, or had made comments about that sort of proclivity, or had been entertaining Jeffrey Epstein and letting him troll for towel girls around the pool at Mar-a-Lago, and then, let's say, put the prosecutor that gave him the lightest sentence possible in his cabinet. That would worry me. But since that did happen, that is interesting. As I was reciting all those facts, I wasn't sure. But as it happens, this all applies to this administration, and we're totally not. But only the rest of the world. Only Boko Haram disappears hundreds of girls at a time. So really, why even contemplate this whole thing? He's an honorable man, I'm sure.
More to come on that, I'm sure. Here are the actual tweets that Trump had sent out on Germany. He said, "We don't want what's happening with immigration in Europe to happen with us. The people of Germany are turning against their leadership as migration is rocking the already tenuous Berlin coalition. Crime in Germany is way up. It's actually down. Big mistake made all over Europe in allowing millions of people in who have so strongly and violently changed their culture." And Vox says, Trump just tweeted crime in Germany is way up. It's actually not.
Yeah, well,
it's actually at its lowest level since 1992. And of course, we know here that immigrants are less likely to commit a crime than are native-born Americans.
Who are also
so, all of it is built on lies. And that's why it's so important to point out it's all about lies. Now, here's a guy, Will Bunch is a liberal columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I have a piece of his that I put up this morning, but he just tweeted something that somebody sent to him.
All right.
I can only read a bowdlerized version of it. It says, "We don't want these effing people in our country. When they stop coming in illegally, your problem will go away. Until you lib pussies get this, it'll continue to get worse. Do it the right way or get the F out. It's not that difficult to comprehend even for you." And Will Bunch retweeted that whole comment with the heading economic anxiety. So, I mean, it's pretty clear that racism and xenophobia are driving so much of this. Yeah. And not only is it driving it, it's in the White House because Stephen Miller is writing this policy, and he's a Nazi.
Yes. Well, that's bad.
A white supremacist. Somebody who thinks that this is really good policy and actually would be perfectly happy if Trump can't figure out how to make a deal on this.
Yes.
So, you have that. And I don't think he's going to win on this, but there's a good portion of America, the 25% or so, that, 23% were happy to support Nixon even at the time of his resignation. A quarter of the population is always going to be like this. It's not new. George Wallace got a lot of votes.
Yeah.
When he ran for president. And there's always going to be that segment of the population, but it's not the majority. And so long as the majority actually comes out and votes, we can do something about this, and we certainly intend to in November.
Well, that's our intention.
Well, we've been doing it in the specials, and it's working. So
yes. Okay. Well, slowly, but yes. Well, there's nothing we can do in terms of, short of, I don't know, dragging them out of the White House and tarring and feathering them. But that's discouraged, though it was good enough for the founders. And so I often think perhaps we'd do better that way, especially if we did it in tricorn hats and waving tea bags. Then it would be okay. Not only that, it would get television coverage, and a couple of us would be interviewed about it as well.
So here's an interesting piece, I thought, from Elizabeth Brunig, who writes about religion in the Washington Post, and she was talking about Jeff Sessions' use of the Bible to justify all of this stuff.
Oh, yes.
And she writes, the greater the truth, the worse the lie. The corruption of the best is the worst of all. People mislead one another all the time about temporary and venial things, which constitutes its own category of error, but rarely, even in the moral wasteland of American politics, do they get around to prevaricating about the eternal and the cosmic. Lying about the capital T, transcendent truth, is a category of error all of its own, whether you spend most of your time fooling others or just yourself, and then talks about Sessions and Huckabee using the Bible to justify moral reasoning about this policy. And she finishes by saying, dealing compassionately with strangers seems to be a minimal requirement for just leadership in the model set forth by God, a theme that carries into the New Testament, where Christ's followers are taught to view themselves as wanderers on earth and to treat others with appropriate empathetic mercy. Some Christians aren't strangers in the world at all. Some are very much at home here, or believe they are, and think there's no tension between the desire of God and the desire of man. People can believe any number of things, especially given the right incentives. If you had all the power in the world, maybe you also would hear a serpent dipping its smooth body down from some shadowy boa to say, God wants you to do whatever you like with your power, and whatever you do with it is good. And that's how she describes Jeff Sessions. And wow. I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah, that's a little, scary even. Where does she describe this?
In her article.
Okay. Well, yes, but I didn't think she was doing it with hand puppets, but okay. Yeah. She might.
Would you actually like to see it?
I would.
So read along. Oh, yeah, well, I could do that.
I wanted to hear you read it, but I would like to be able to share it with others so that they can call others.
Well, there it is. The title is Sessions Invents a Faith All His
Excellent. Own. Okay. What? Where? Oh, there it is. Oh, look, and it's illustrated with the Bible as well.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Here's one from Mark Sanford. Appears in The Hill.
He likes Bibles.
GOP lawmakers running for cover over fear of Trump tweets. He takes issue with Bob Corker saying that the GOP is now a cult. He says it's not so much a cult. I wouldn't go so far as cult, but I would just say that from an electoral sense, people are running for cover because they don't want to be on the losing side of a presidential tweet. And from a popular standpoint, it's almost a Faustian bargain. I'll pander to you if you pander to me. And he goes on to say, the Republican Party and the conservative movement more broadly has become less about principles and more about loyalty to Trump himself. You can see that in the piece I read to you from Politico about the GOP House abandoning entitlement reform.
All right.
That's actually kind of shocking if you think about it long term. And he says, I think we got to do a whole lot of soul searching in this party. I think the only way that happens is when they lose.
I guess so.
Because right now their religion is winning. Anything to win.
I guess.
Look at Mitch McConnell blowing up the Senate in order to make sure that Gorsuch is sitting in that seat.
Yes. Among other things, I don't know. It's
voter ID, blocking voters. I mean, whatever it takes to win, that's what you do. Pennsylvania not happy with the judges who decided the gerrymandering case, and now they want to blow up the courts there.
Yes,
gerrymander the courts.
Judges who ruled on it. It's
all about power.
Disturbing and amazing that I guess, really, honestly, to get around to the point where we're taking our advice from Mark Sanford. Whatever, I guess you cling to whatever you can from time to time, and I guess now he feels free to admit these things, and he has these occasional bouts of conscience, I suppose, in between hikes on the Appalachian Trail and voting for whatever it is he later turns out to hate.
Well, my favorite Felix Frankfurter quote, wisdom too often never comes, so ought not to reject it merely because it comes late.
I guess so. It's easy for you to say from, the Supreme Court and beyond the grave, but still, the point is he said it when he was alive. And, it's true, but it doesn't make us feel any better. That wasn't his job, though. He wasn't a psychiatrist. He was a judge.
All right. I should mention, by the way, Roger Stone is in even more trouble over this Russia probe.
Yes, excellent.
Turns out that he had contact with a Russian claiming to want dirt on the Clintons. Yeah. And Mike Caputo, who is
who's this guy? I forget.
A Trump election aide, is part of all of this. So they're releasing the story themselves, claiming that they were a victim of a scam by the FBI. Presumably they tell this to Devin Nunes, and then Nunes will start subpoenaing FBI records and try to make it the deep state trying to get, Trump people all over again. When in fact, it looks like they got caught red-handed doing something shady that they weren't supposed to do. So more on that to come. We've only had the Roger Stone version of it so far because he's released this to the paper. And we know he lies, so we'll have to see what comes.
Yeah. We have two Stone versions. One all the way up until like the other day where he didn't have any contact with anybody Russian. And then the next day, yes, I did. And it was a spy and he was doing exactly what you said you feared he was doing. He was, but some other thing. Therefore, all right, well, I guess we'll see what Nunes, whenever Nunes involves himself in something like this, it makes news, and it makes bad news, usually for the Trump administration. It's briefly something they cling to, and then it's exposed as a horrific, upside-down lie, and I don't know why we haven't really found ourselves rid of Nunes quite yet, but
that's a great question, because clearly, he is compromised.
Yes, to say the least. Although, again, they put Kellyanne Conway on television all the time, and they do it
put her husband.
Knowing that, I'm surprised they haven't done that. I'm sure he'd get just as many clicks, I assume, because he's saying things that are, really interesting based on what's happening here. But they continue to want to do it, and I guess she's a name brand, although why they don't realize that this is booking her is to say, I enjoy using the show for lies and launching and supporting lies. And I guess they think, everyone will at least they'll be using our logo when they tweet around pictures of the lies being told. I can only assume that that's what's driving it.
Speaking of lies, there's an interesting piece from the Washington Post this morning. Again, June 13 through 15, Washington Post ABC News poll of a random sample of 495 U.S. adults, error margin of plus or minus 5.5%. But Majority of Americans say it's unlikely the summit will lead North Korea to give up on nuclear weapons. Remember, Trump's already told us it did.
Yes. Well, they're done with that. Correct.
Yeah. But they don't buy it. They're very skeptical.
Oh.
And I think that their skepticism is important because if you're skeptical about what Trump is trying to sell you on the summit, and then you become skeptical about what Trump is trying to sell you on this immigration policy and separating kids, it leads to being skeptical about what Trump is trying to sell you on a whole bunch of other stuff. So there's unintended consequences to the immigration fight that are happening here that I think will definitely be worth watching. And that's going to be my segment for today.
Okay.
I think that there's some positive within the negative here. The policy is awful. I don't think it's going to stand. I think it's hurting Trump politically, and I think it's going to hurt Republicans politically. And by the way, I'm over it, and I think it's okay.
All right. Well, I'll go along with the part where it's okay that we hurt Republicans with it. And I'm happy to see that. And keep one eye, now that you mentioned the North Korea thing, I would say keep one eye out for another summit soon. Trump is high on the summit thing, even though it didn't work.
Well, he sent Pompeo out to actually do some negotiations. We'll see what happens.
Yes, and he now apparently wants one with Putin, which amazingly no one in the White House has been able to convince him. Yeah, about the whole Putin thing, people are really thinking that the optics, remember those, at this point are bad, and apparently he cannot be dissuaded from this, and as you know, he was able to insist on a North Korea summit and have it happen within a couple of days, because what happened there doesn't matter, right? So this one too, are you preparing for the summit with Putin? He's the one that's got to prepare. He's the one with instructions, not me. I'm just going to pick up the bag. All right, so be on the lookout for a Putin summit anytime now, and who knows when it could happen? It could happen at the golf course for all we know.
All righty, so that's it for today, and I'm sure stuff will happen. We'll be back on Wednesday. You got another hour of the show to go, but you got plenty of material to talk about here if you want to.
All right, maybe I'll continue. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Says
why
who?
not? Exactly. It can work for me, too.
Yeah.
I don't see why not. All right, thanks, Greg. Take care. We'll check in with you again later in the week. I'm sure something will happen.
I'm sure it will. Take care.
You do the same. I did see, seriously, I have this news somewhere in pocket. There's a whole bunch of stories, although it's now buried under, layers and layers of other deposits from the daily, hourly flood of news. Trump is insistent on inviting Putin to the White House. And interestingly, Putin is apparently not all that interested in meeting with him at the White House, and I'm not 100% sure why that is. And I don't know whether that's a domestic situation for him being like, does it make it, I don't think anybody is mistaking what would happen there as for being summoned to the White House by Trump. I think they all laugh at the idea that Trump is the one in control in this situation. I guess it's possible, for instance, that, I can't meet you at the White House because we're afraid of feedback on the listening devices. If I walk in there, knowing that there are microphones there that Kislyak and others left behind during the visit in which you told them that you had fired Comey, the FBI director, in order to relieve great pressure on the Russia front, and I walk in there with my listening devices, who knows what kind of feedback could be, blasting the ears of those listening on the other end. That could be the concern. Or, it may even be just Putin looking out for his charge here, my ward in the White House. I know, even if you don't, that this won't go well for you domestically if I just, walk into the White House. I don't know. Anyway, The Hill was one of the sources about from which I grabbed one of these stories. I happened to grab this one because it was illustrated with a photo of Trump looking about as bad and in as poor a state of health as I have seen him. And I guess this is why they paint him orange. I guess he had missed his fresh coat for a day or two, and his skin is really like mottled and freckly and really just horribly wrinkly and leathern. And, I mean, look, skin gets that way when you get older. There's nothing you can do about that. You could help by not being out in the sun and not painting your face with I don't know what kind of toxic chemicals, but it's really one of the worst photos of him going in terms of it revealing his aging. However, that's not the main focus of the story. White House officials ignored Trump's request to invite Putin to the White House, according to this report, and I'm sure that they are gleaning this information off of someone somewhere else. By the way, credit to UPI, United Press International, for the awful, awful photo of Mr. Trump. That is to say, it was a great photo on their part. It's just that Trump looks awful in it. And I mean, really, you'll see later on. The White House officials, this is an interesting twist on this. Not only does he want to have a summit with Putin, and not only does he want to have the summit with Putin in the White House, but the rest of the White House doesn't want it. And it's kind of funny in that they're saying, well, look, you don't seem to be acknowledging the poor optics of this. And so, perhaps unique among presidents, what we can do about that is, with Donald Trump, you can ignore the request. I mean, it's at your peril. He may be serious about it and follow up on it and be angry with you and fire you. This is possible. But if you think you're doing him a service by intervening and preventing such a summit from taking place, one of the favored methodologies is, he's a dotard. Why don't you just ignore the request and wait for him to forget all about it because he's a scatterbrained moron? White House officials ignored a request from President Trump last year to invite Russian President Vladimir Putin to the White House, hoping instead that Trump would simply not raise the issue again. And I mean, the fact that you are hearing about this story now in June, where in which White House officials ignored the request last year, I guess suggests that they were right. At least for 6 months, Trump did forget all about it. I don't know whether his remembering the issue is what brought it back to the fore again, or whether there's somebody inside the White House who's as dumb as he is who spoke about it on the record to try to do something and affect policy one way or the other. That's how they run this place, through leaks. An unnamed official told the Washington Post on Friday that Trump privately asked his aides in November to set up a bilateral meeting with Putin at the White House after meeting the Russian leader in Vietnam, remember that, at an economic summit that month. And remember, they have a great relationship. We've met a number of times. I had the Miss Universe pageant. I did meet him. I didn't meet him. We do talk. I don't talk. We've never, so whenever he's being asked by investigators, what's your relationship with Putin? I don't have one. Whenever he's bragging to the newspapers about being able to make deals, he's his best friend. Aides ignored the request, the source told the Post, and I guess, did we read the article? It was on Friday. Let's see which one were they looking at here? Yeah, and I don't think we got to this one, but it probably came out after we did our show on Friday. Anyway, aides ignored the request, source told the Post, hoping it would just be a passing interest, which was wishful thinking, to say the least, about Donald Trump and Putin. We have read, how long it's been since he decided that on his bucket list was going to be sitting down for meetings with Putin, one-on-one sort of thing. We did discuss this, I think, at the end of last week about, I think, the special value that Trump puts on being able to call a meeting a summit. Anyway, after that meeting in Vietnam, the president said he wanted to invite Putin to the White House, one U.S. official told the Post. We ignored it. They decided, let's wait and see if he raises it again, the officials continued. According to the Post, Trump has been asking for such a summit since November. A senior State Department official told the newspaper that while both sides were eager... there's some autoplaying video. While both sides were eager to orchestrate such a summit, there were concerns about the amount of preparation needed to get Trump ready for such a meeting. Well, that's out the window now, right? Personally, I would be very reluctant to put my president into a meeting where he has to talk about dashas or he has to talk about staffing patterns at embassies. Why? there is a lot of work that has to be done ahead of a meeting like this, an official said. I mean, does he have to talk about that? Or I think he wants to talk about that, about dashes for himself, I would think. News of Trump's desire for a summit with Putin comes just one day after a White House aide said the Trump administration was exploring a possible summit between the two leaders, and days after the president issued repeated calls for Russia to be reinstated to the Group of Seven, comments that were mostly unsupported by other members of the group. They were uniformly unsupported, I think. I don't think any decisions have been made or details have been worked out, but I believe both sides are exploring an opportunity to try to do that, National Security Council member Richard Hooker said Thursday. According to the Wall Street Journal, Putin has also considered organizing a meeting with Trump in Vienna. That's where he wants to do it, interestingly enough, reportedly discussing the issue with Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz. And I did see that reported. I don't think it was during the show on Friday, but that they made some particular, maybe it was, that they made some particular comment about Austria perhaps being the venue for it because they had elected a new right-wing government there whose operative politics, I guess, match the new right-wing authoritarian bent of both everything that's always been going on in Russia under Putin, and I guess now in our country under the supposed leadership of Donald Trump. Well, we hope that people can separate the government from the country and the president from the government, for that matter. We are all around the world learning to do that with Russia, perhaps, in many cases under the auspices of the Magnitsky Act, both here in the United States and in Canada, where I did learn over the weekend, now that they are more seriously considering the sanctions route. They do, in fact, have a Magnitsky Act, so they have a legal, legal vector, perhaps, by which they could deliver such sanctions after all. Interesting. We'll be right back. All right, then. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All the timing is screwed up as we hit the wrong button on, we do this from time to time. All we have to do is fade the music out here and everything will be fixed. Just relax, hold your horses. We went ahead and prepared that nice 1-minute break music that makes it that much easier to edit the show later on for podcast consumption. But that's neither here nor there, as the wrong button was hit and all the work we did now for naught. It's okay. We can continue on. Let's see. Yes, Michael Musson, thank you very much for your commentary. There really isn't any benefit to Putin meeting at the White House. Like I said, it's all downside, really, for him to meet at the White House, even if he is not concerned at all about the optics of what's going on. There's just really no reason for him to travel to away territory on that one. And, it would look a lot better, of course, if he were able to summon Trump to the Kremlin. But I think he's actually kind of interested in, maintaining what parts of the illusion are still in his control. I think he's a realist in terms of, knowing that the cat's out of the bag. But that doesn't mean he needs to feed the fire by having Trump come to the Kremlin. And I think Trump is sensitive enough, if not to the optics of what it would mean for the country, he's sensitive enough to the optics of what it would mean for him to be seen as being called into his boss's office for a yearly review. All right, let's see. What else have we got to go with? There's, again, just too many directions to keep track of. Let's peek in pocket here and comb through some of these things and see if we can't find out, remind myself of the things I wanted to tell you. All right. Yes. I guess in leaving for the break, which then I mistimed, I was speaking to you about the fact that Canada has got its own Magnitsky Act of sorts. And remember, that shouldn't surprise you. This was an international effort to, ideally the supporters of what became the Magnitsky Act here in the United States had hoped that the entirety of the world would pass such an act and isolate Russia completely. So it should come as no surprise that Canadians were also approached with similar ideas and adopted them. And as a matter of fact, if you were alive and reading Daily Kos, both, over the weekend, you would have seen John Per's commentary on it on what we like to call Sunday Kos, because, of course, it happens on Sunday on Daily Kos. Could Trump face Magnitsky Act sanctions? And yes, he could, from Canada, as we mentioned earlier in the show. And then I got confused about the name of the magazine from which I had, in which I had seen the idea first expressed. I don't know if it had come up earlier anywhere else, but I said, it's in McLean's magazine. And then I said, that can't be right, because maybe I'm confused and thinking of McLean, Virginia, the nearby close-in suburb of Washington, D.C., which I had hoped to avoid traveling to over the weekend in my search for a new pair of eyeglasses. Since to throw a little personal note in there. A personal endorsement for the people down at Village Eye. They're fantastic, but their glasses are just too damn expensive, and I can't do it this time. But they have a really good eye for picking out styles that match your face. It's fantastic. They're really good at it, and if you are at your local whatever Pearl Vision Center, we're stuck with a local provider that doesn't seem to have anything nice. Why, they always have something to satisfy every budget, so long as every budget is $400 or $500 higher than you could possibly afford. And every once in a great while, I'm able to swing it with something on special there, but I didn't have to. But they're all over my computer screen because I went searching for this, looking at new pairs of glasses that I could order online where I might be able to afford them. And, of course, now I've told the internet that I want something, and it won't leave me alone. So it's flashing all over the place. Anyway, I figured, it can't be McLean's magazine. You're thinking about McLean, Virginia. It must be that other Mac-L thing that comes to mind, McLaren, the very fancy car for which there is anonymously enough, I would say, a dealership out here in our neck of the woods. There's an awful lot of internet money still floating around in the area, which is why people think that Amazon might, in fact, choose the Northern Virginia area for their latest campus or whatever it was, whatever the hoopla was. This is how they soak up excess money in the area. In addition to having giant drainage ditches for all of the excess runoff water, when the rainstorms come during the summer, we also run off all of the excess income with a Lamborghini, McLaren, Alfa Romeo dealership or something like that. And I think they have a couple of other really wacky things too. I didn't know about McLaren until I went. Remember way back when I was looking for a new minivan and we went test driving at CarMax? I think I spoke about this on the air. I'm sure of it. And I think I may even have told you this story, that I ended up having to swerve around a broken down McLaren on the test drive street. We're just down the road. I was test driving, I think, what was it, the VW Rutan minivan, and I passed the broken down McLaren on the street. It was a lot of fun. Anyway, that's not what I meant to talk about. I meant to talk about whether or not Trump could face Magnitsky Act sanctions. John Per has summed it up for you who are weekend readers over at Daily Kos, and it really is beginning to catch on. And there's a lot of discussion of it, and that's a good thing. And I didn't do it, but I wish I did. Anyway, already branded by a survey of historians as America's worst ever, the presidency of Donald Trump may also live in infamy as the most ironic. After all, the man who ran to make America great again has already ceded global climate leadership to China and Europe, withdrawn from the Pacific Trade Partnership created by the United States. That doesn't anger a whole lot of people sometimes, and angered American allies, those who weren't angered earlier, by both abandoning the P5+1 Iranian nuclear agreement and unilaterally triggering a trade war. Triggering might be fun. I don't know. The self-proclaimed voice of the forgotten man who promised health insurance for everybody and remember it was going to be beautiful, has instead delivered a massive tax cut windfall for the wealthy and sabotaged health insurance coverage for millions. All of this really beside the point, but a good introduction. And a full 18 months after his election, Trump still rages against crooked Hillary to the rapturous cheers of lock her up from his ardent followers, even as special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation continues to produce a wave of indictments against his campaign team and administration. And, of course, Paul Manafort spent the weekend in jail. How was Father's Day, Paul? But the ironies of Donald Trump's White House tenure may not end there. After having been aided by Russian intervention in his ascent to power, there is a chance, albeit a small one, that Trump's fall could result from foreign powers applying an international sanctions regime to him and his family's businesses. When I started cheerleading for the idea of sanction Trump, I suppose, I did get a little bit of pushback from practical-minded folks who said, well, what would the mechanism for that really be? How could the Canadians do such a thing? Is there a legal mechanism? And then others saying, well, I would rather see this done with due process. And it was all very fine and upstanding of them, of course. But I wasn't able to answer them because I said, hey, I don't really know how the Canadians would engineer such a thing. And it's not that I am convinced that now they can't, but rather to remind all of us that that's up to them, how they do it and how they justify it legally. And I'm sure if they can, they'll contemplate it. And if they can't, they won't do it. They won't go out of their way and ruin their country just to bother Trump. But remember that due process in Canada, in the UK, in France, in Germany, wherever, is not necessarily the same thing as it is here. There are many similar concepts, but the process is likely to be slightly different. And in many places, in many ways, around the world, you can find yourself surprised, I believe, at the differences between the American judicial system and others. Anyway, as we were saying, the irony doesn't end there. After having been aided by Russian intervention in his ascent to power, there's a chance that Trump's fall could result from foreign powers applying an international sanctions regime to him and his family's businesses. Adding insult to injury, those punishments would be made possible by the Magnitsky Act, originally introduced in the United States to combat the corruption and human rights abuses of the Putin government in Moscow. The idea of personally sanctioning Trump arose on the eve of the American debacle at the recent G7 summit. And that was a pretty good setting for it. By the way, I assume this gets addressed somewhere later in John's piece, but another of the great ironies and adding insult to injury, not just that the punishments would be made possible by the Magnitsky Act, but that it was the problems that the Russian government had with the Magnitsky Act, even though, and it's a telltale sign, really, the Russian government was officially annoyed and offended by the Magnitsky Act, despite the fact that the targets of the Magnitsky Act are private individuals largely. In Russia, it's just that there's no line between those private individuals who function as oligarchs in Russia and the official governance of Russia. They are one and the same, both, and I guess maybe that's the word we want to use for governance rather than government, if we're having difficulty separating the two concepts. But yeah, that's what the Trump Tower, the infamous Trump Tower meeting between Don Jr. and Paul Manafort, who's now in jail, and Jared Kushner, who can't get a security clearance unless the president intervenes personally and gives it to him, which he did, etc., etc. That's what that meeting was about, not Russian adoption or anything like that. The Russian adoption issue was a reaction to the passage of the Magnitsky Act, if you need reminding. The Russians who attended the meeting were there to see about the lifting of Magnitsky Act sanctions and hopefully the repeal of the Magnitsky Act itself. But we never did get around to that one, and he couldn't deliver on it because he hadn't been elected yet. Anyway, back to John's telling of it. Even before he disgraced his country in Quebec, Trump had, by the end of May, put more tariffs on longtime U.S. allies than he has on China, his supposed bad guy on trade, despite having previously admitted to lying to Justin Trudeau's face in March, and all the rest of Justin Trudeau as well, because it was there underneath his face. Trump accused the Canadian Prime Minister of making, quote, false statements and betraying him. Trudeau had merely stated that Canada would respond with regret to Trump's insulting steel and aluminum tariffs because Canadians will not be pushed around. after Trump economic advisors Larry Kudlow and Peter Navarro ratcheted up the incendiary rhetoric by respectively charging Trudeau had stabbed us in the back and so deserved a special place in hell. Foreign Minister Freeland, we're going to skip that first name again. Are we sure it's Kirstjen, maybe? We'll refer to as the Honorable Foreign Minister Freeland. That's, I think, respectful enough. She had had enough from Canada's closest ally. The national security pretext, she said, is absurd and frankly insulting to Canadians, the closest and strongest ally the United States has had. Canada does not believe that ad hominem attacks are a particularly appropriate or useful way to conduct our relations with other countries. True, but I suppose if they have to respond in kind, they just might. The appropriate way, John's story continues, to conduct relations with Donald Trump's America, Scott Gilmore wrote in Maclean's, might be sanctioning Trump himself. Instead of taxing American goods, Gilmore suggested Canada and the Western allies should collectively pressure the only pain point that matters to this president, his family and their assets. Pointing out that French President Emmanuel Macron, UK Prime Minister Theresa May, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel had failed to budge Trump on the Paris Climate Agreement or the Iran nuclear deal, retaliatory trade penalties, like the diplomatic strategies before now, will not work. And back over to Scott Gilmore on this one, and we I don't think we ever made it all the way to reading through his article. We merely have incorporated it by reference. Here's some of the main body. I was waiting for somebody else to do this work. Thanks, John. As I've pointed out before, the president can be successfully engaged, and countries like Ukraine, China, and Qatar have demonstrated this. And that already raises your eyebrows. You know how they've demonstrated it. It's the bad way. But there's a flip side to it. He continues, when they want something from the United States, they skip the State Department and even the White House staff. And, that's a good idea. They're hiding from him on the Putin thing. You never know what else they'll bury in an attempt to, spruce up the optics on things. When they want something from the United States, countries like Ukraine, China, Qatar, they skip the State Department, skip the White House staff. Instead of approaching their problems state to state, they go state to man. Although really, in many cases, those states are able to allow their leadership to just basically go man to man on these things. These countries focus on what Trump wants on a personal level, to enrich his family. So, Beijing granted Ivanka trademarks. Qatar invested in one of Jared's office towers. And Ukraine, with Slavic candor, easy there, Gilmore, simply wired $500,000 to the president's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen. I propose that instead of and don't forget that, by the way, in all the other messes, Michael Cohen eventually should go down for that one as well. I propose that instead of taxing the import of American serviettes, we tax Trump. And it's a good proposal, Scott. Well done. In the spirit of the Magnitsky Act, Canada and the Western allies come together to collectively pressure the only pain point that matters to this president, his family, and their assets. This could take the form of special taxation on their current operations. That feels like un-American, but then again, one of the most, distinguishing features of Canada is that it isn't America. So it's okay for them to be un-American, just so long as they are Canadian. We can't demand that they be more like us. Just be yourselves, Canada, I say. But true, they, does that feel like something they shouldn't do? Because we don't really have a say in it. If it's okay for them and they have a mechanism that doesn't require bending over backwards, maybe we ought to let them use it. So, as he's saying, this could take the form of special taxation on their current operations, freezing of assets, or even sanctions against senior staff. And by the way, once again, if you do think this is terribly un-American, why do we have a Magnitsky Act? It's not un-American. We are allowed to do this against Russians. And I know the initial feeling, I know it's very difficult to get over. Well, this is very un-American. Well, of course we do these things to other foreign people. It's when foreign people do this to us that it's a problem, right? Well, remember, one, it's not us, it's him. And two, remember, he's not the government. He's just the jerk sitting in the chair. and he's doing a very poor job of it anyway. This is not such a bad idea after all, perhaps. Canada, Scott Gilmore writes, could add a tax to Trump properties equal to any tariff unilaterally imposed by Washington. And why not? He's the only one interested in imposing this, right? I mean, it does recognize right off the bat that even the weaklings in Congress, the Republican weaklings in Congress, are willing to put their names to statements in disagreement with the tariffs. So you might as well leverage that. There isn't that much that these people are willing to speak out on. Take advantage of it when they invite you to separate Trump from his party and Trump from his country as well. So, special taxation on their current operations, the Trump family, freezing of assets, sanctions against senior staff even, who are working in government capacity, supposedly. Canada could add a tax to Trump properties equal to any tariff unilaterally, and it is unilaterally, imposed by Washington. The European Union could revoke any travel visas for senior staff in the Trump organization. And the United Kingdom could temporarily close his golf course. Hey, why not? Does it seem un-American? It's not America. I'm just saying. It's out there. And boy, by the way, having a summit with Putin in Europe becomes increasingly difficult if Trump, his family, his staff, etc., are not supposedly allowed to travel to Europe. It does become a difficult thing. Now, they could do this by Skype, and they wouldn't even care very much whether or not it was secure. They've shown no interest in that to date, minus, of course, all the people who spent all their time on the campaign trying to have secure back-channel communications. They tried the back-channel. It's just they weren't particularly good at figuring out how to keep them secure. All right, back to John Per's commentary on all this. On its face, Gilmore's column does indeed have the stench of bad satire about it. But when he admits, and that's, I think, Gilmore's own terminology from it, but when he admits, I am sane enough to know this proposal does not sound sane, Gilmore may be selling himself short, because Canada and the UK, among other countries, already have in place the legal framework to target the Trump organization's assets. And we have it too. And it's not crazy when we have it. It's just crazy when the foreigners do, right? The Magnitsky Act, the mechanism to punish ruling elites for the corruption and human rights abuses they perpetrate in their own countries, was pioneered by the United States. Why, it's not un-American at all. In December of 2012, President Barack Obama, you remember that guy, signed the Russia and Moldova Jackson-Vanik Repeal and Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act. Rule of law? Where have I heard that before? The bill replaced outdated Cold War rules by granting permanent normal trade relations with Russia, but that's not all the law did. The legislation enabled the United States to publicly name and shame human rights violators. As Reuters explained it at the time, it also directs Obama to bar Russian human rights violators from entering the United States and freeze any assets they may have in the U.S. banks. The provision is named in honor of Sergei Magnitsky, a Russian anti-corruption lawyer many U.S. lawmakers believe was beaten to death in a Russian jail in 2009. But it wasn't a jail, it just had chain link fencing, I'm sure. The driving force behind the new law was American businessman Bill Browder. And by the way, we might as well just put out here, right now, this doesn't mean that we think Bill Browder is right, or is a hero, or is anyone worth emulating, or isn't perhaps corrupt in his own way. It just means the clock, stopped or not, was right at the time we checked it, and that's all. Anyway, Bill Browder, founder of London-based hedge fund Hermitage Capital, which is also often a good tip that you're not really necessarily speaking to a great person, but I'm sure there are some fantastic hedge fund managers out there somewhere. In 2007, a group from the Russian Interior Ministry defrauded Hermitage to the tune of $230 million. And that sucks, right? As Steve Cole reported in The New Yorker, that's when Sergei Magnitsky got involved in the case. Ready? Around this time, Sergei Magnitsky, then a 35-year-old Russian lawyer for Hermitage who worked for an American firm, opened an investigation. In 2008, he testified to a Russian commission about the evidence of a conspiracy he had uncovered. He was thereafter arrested and accused of committing the massive fraud himself. Well, that's how you uncovered it, they said. In prison, he was kept in appalling conditions, fell ill, and was allegedly beaten with rubber truncheons. He died in custody on November 16, 2009. Despite Obama's concern that the Magnitsky Act could threaten Russia's roles in helping to defuse the Iran nuclear program and leaning on the Assad government in Syria, remember, Obama approached this cautiously, the president ultimately signed the bill. But soon, developments inside of Russia and out created pressure to extend the reach of the Magnitsky Act to despots around the world. One factor fueling calls for a global Magnitsky Act was the 2014 Russian incursion into Ukraine and Moscow's subsequent annexation of the Crimea. But while corrupt leaders there and in Central Asia were increasingly in the spotlight, and increasingly signing deals with Donald Trump, I might add, so too were the regimes in countries including oil-rich Venezuela and poverty-stricken Gambia. There, President, Yahya Jammeh, that's my best guess, that one, labeled the worst dictator you never heard of, except for right now, and I think that's largely true, was imprisoning and killing political opponents while extracting millions of dollars from his desperately poor country. A bipartisan effort led by Democratic Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland and Republicans John McCain of Arizona. Well, it says Republicans, but I don't know whether we've left one of them out as a typo or multiple Republicans was the typo. But anyway, they led to the passage and signing of the Global Magnitsky Act in late 2016. As Senator Cardin explained, with today's passage of the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, the United States has added a critical tool to our diplomatic toolbox, making clear that gross violators of human rights and those who engage in serious acts of corruption cannot escape the consequences of their action even when their home country fails to act. Bigger question, does it apply when their home country happens to be the United States? And the gross violation of human rights, perhaps the separation of families and imprisonment of toddlers and children, or gross corruption in the form of flagrant violation of the emoluments clause and solicitation of bribes for friends and family members from corrupt regimes around the world. John continues, it's not just the United States that has added this critical tool to its diplomatic toolbox. Last October, Canada unanimously passed its own version of Magnitsky legislation, the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act. You know any corrupt foreign officials, Canada? As the CBC reported, these laws target the property, the assets, the holdings, the wealth of corrupt officials who have committed gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. The next month, Ottawa issued its first list of Magnitsky sanctions targeting 52 human rights violators in Russia, Venezuela, and South Sudan. As Foreign Minister Freeland explained, Canada is determined to protect human rights and combat corruption worldwide. Really, the whole world. Today's announcements send a clear message that Canada will take action against individuals who have profited from acts of significant corruption or who have been involved in gross violations of human rights. And when it comes to gross violation of human rights, the murders and attempted murders of Russian expatriates in England certainly fits the bill. Following the nerve agent attack on Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in London, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson and Home Secretary Amber Rudd led the Conservative drive in Parliament to pass a UK Magnitsky amendment as part of a larger sanctions bill. As Johnson explained, the amendment was not limited to Russia. These provisions will allow the UK to act against those responsible for the serious offenses worldwide. For any serious offenses, I guess, worldwide, the UK stands up for human rights globally. And right now, according to the United Nations, serious human rights offenses are taking place, you'll never guess where. You will guess. I think you can. Along the border of the United States and Mexico. In fact, just where you likely would have pointed to even without my prompting, because you're so smart and well-informed. In April, Americans learned the Trump administration had separated hundreds of children from their parents, These were not unaccompanied minors arriving at the border or merely undocumented families caught crossing into the United States. These were refugees seeking asylum, fleeing violent gangs, including the MS-13 gang, so vilified by President Trump, and fleeing domestic violence or other threats to their safety. These asylum seekers are being treated as presumptive criminals in violation of U.S. and international law, and it's wrong, and you know it. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I am distracted about, everything that's going on at the moment. When we left off, and I've seen some, we'll see if we can hold these other comments until at least toward the end of our reading of John's write-up here on the Magnitsky Act path for Canada and others around the world to sanction Trump, as I think they ought rightly to do. We left off, of course, reminding everybody that one of the triggers is human rights violations, and that increasingly here at home and around the world, the separation of families at the border, particularly among those seeking asylum as refugees, is viewed, I think correctly, as a human rights violation. And a good reminder, of course, that many of the people arriving at the border are fleeing even the dangerous MS-13 gang that Donald Trump only cares about when they operate inside the United States, even though they are creating a border crisis for him as he speaks. However, let's see. We left off by saying, all of this, by the way, treating asylum seekers as presumptive criminals is in violation of U.S. and international law. Far from being sent into foster care or whatever, infants as young as 4 months old have been taken from their parents' arms. Children are being warehoused in cages that they say aren't cages. And when that capacity is exceeded, President Trump is planning to erect tent cities, because the guy who did that, Joe Arpaio, has, of course, been convicted for it, but then pardoned by the president because it's all totally awesome. By the way, as we've been going on with this story, they've gone from insisting that the cages aren't cages to now insisting that the families they're breaking up aren't families. I see now that Secretary Nielsen has been quoted as proclaiming now, "We do not have the luxury of pretending that all individuals coming to this country as a family unit are in fact a family." So breaking them up and tearing the children away, why, they may very well be spies or imposters, or else possibly a live-action guerrilla production of We're the Millers. Maybe that's it. Armando, ready to chime in. Okay, hey, Armando, how you doing? I can imagine what's on your mind.
What? Because I
don't know
actually
what I'm talking about.
Called in on independent grounds.
Okay.
What were you talking about? I don't
I'm actually talking about the increasing call or response, I guess, to the call in Canada to use their own Magnitsky Act to sanction Trump personally, and White House staffers as well, and how the Magnitsky Act has actually been adopted by most, if not all, of our allies in some form or another, and how ironic that is on so many levels, and that the original call to sanction Trump, we got a little bit of pushback in terms of, I know that sounds like it would feel good, but what legal basis is there really? Well, there's plenty, as it turns out, and the Canadian Magnitsky Act passed their parliament unanimously not all that long ago, And now we have members of Parliament during Prime Minister's question time asking, is this something we ought to be considering, and can we do it? And the foreign minister answering the question on behalf of the government and saying, it's on the table. We have to look at it. We passed this Magnitsky Act for a reason. I know we all thought it was going to be Russians, but we were all also quite explicit in passing this thing and stating that it was not going to be limited to Russia. And, well, if we're facing gross corruption and human rights abuses next door, we ought to say so and do so. So, very interesting.
I'm all for it.
Hey, I'm okay with it
Canadian,
too.
But I vote aye.
Yeah, right. I vote that you vote.
There's my contribution
aye,
to the conversation.
Yeah.
Can I direct your attention to the just released Wisconsin gerrymandering case that was handed down?
Okay.
Handed down by the Supreme
Breaking
Court.
news, I guess.
Yeah, it's breaking. It broke about 5 minutes ago. They dismissed the case on the grounds of lack of standing, but they said.
Okay.
It's not a dismissal with prejudice. We're going to give you a chance to prove your standing in the lower court.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, how could they? Yeah, it'd be hard to dismiss it with prejudice if you weren't speaking to anybody who had the authority to be there in the first place. But that's
can I speak to something on this?
Yeah.
Because you know what I always say about the Supreme Court, courts in general, particularly when they use or decide that they're going to use this stupid standing stuff.
Okay.
You remember the ACCA case?
I will say so, if you wish.
Yeah. There was no standing for that case. There was literally there was no standing to challenge the Affordable Care Act.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah,
when they decided
who's
that
ACCA?
case.
I'm trying to think.
The first one.
Yes.
The Sebelius case.
All right. Affordable
there
Care
wasn't
Act.
standing.
Yes. Right.
The case was not in effect. I mean, the provisions of the case, the mandate, which is what they were, and which was the whole premise of the Commerce Clause, was not in effect yet.
All right, so no live controversy at that point. Is that what you're saying?
2014.
Okay.
There was no standing.
All right.
If you apply the standing doctrines at all, there was clearly no standing. The case should have been dismissed from the trial court on. There was no standing.
If you're consistent about it.
Dismiss that case on standing.
No, apparently not.
They didn't. They decided, as we all know. And, the Affordable Care Act was upheld, but, it created all sorts of problems, that decision. Mm. Today, they decided there was no standing. Now, standing is an issue, just that it can be taken up at any time and reviewed by any court. That is, at the trial court level and at the appellate court level. It can be brought up for the first time.
Yes, just because they either ignored it or whatever below doesn't mean that a higher court can't say, "Hey, you forgot this," and
right.
if they decide that it was improperly ignored and then has a valid point, then they can dismiss the case at that point. Okay. Right.
It's what's called the subject matter jurisdiction question, which can be raised at any time.
Okay.
The theory being that it implicates the court's power to even be paying attention to any of these things.
Yes.
All right. It wasn't ignored in the lower court. It was actually discussed. There's a decision, yada, yada. And you can ask at the higher court level for briefing and submission of more evidence and the whole thing. That is, they could have decided the standing question now and just said, well, you've given us all your stuff, and either we agree now or we disagree. This Supreme Court, in a blatantly political act, and let's be clear, the vote was like 8-1. All right?
All right.
There was a deal that was done on the court to get everybody's vote. And what the deal was, I believe, the liberals went along saying all
right, well, we have
by any proof standing. You show this, and you show this, and you show that. They basically gave them a roadmap. Roberts, who I assume would have been the fifth vote on that, did not show the roadmap or candidate. They didn't show a roadmap. right? So they're holding their cards. But the four liberals think that if you do all these things, we can convince either Roberts or Kennedy to go along. Why am I talking about all this? Because this is all a farce, David.
Aww.
This is not Supreme Court jurisprudence, balls and strikes, umpire nonsense. This is political jockeying, political political game playing, and it's all political game playing. This balls and strikes nonsense is just sheer. It's a lie in the Supreme Court.
Well, yeah, even if you view them as umpires, there's plenty that umpires, just to carry.
This is not umpiring. This is this is managing for your team.
Well, yes, I guess it could be. Although I was going to say that umpiring has plenty of procedural leverage and balls and strikes. Yes, but I also got to tell you when you're able to start pitching again, and if you start throwing before I said you had standing to do so, you're out of luck. Even if it was a really great pitch and you caught him looking, I didn't start time again, even though there's no time kept in baseball. You know what I'm saying? The point is, umpires do plenty of things, and trying to limit it to all I do is call balls and strikes was nonsense from the beginning.
Yeah, that is quite the Seinfeldian observation about calling time when there's actually no clock to call time out on.
It's true. Why do you say that? Time out. What time? What are you talking about? You have no standing to call timeout. That's it. We should throw the umpires out.
Yeah, and all you say is true. But let me read you this paragraph, one of the most disingenuous paragraphs in the history of the Supreme Court.
Oh.
To use it in this case. But a plaintiff seeking relief in federal court must first demonstrate that he has standing to do so, including that he has a personal stake in the outcome, distinct from a generally available grievance about government. That threshold requirement ensures that we act as judges and do not engage in policy making properly left to elected representatives. What?
Oh, well, that's just, why didn't you just say it was a political question doctrine?
Exactly.
Instead. That's not.
The problem is if it's a political question, then they can't hear it again. So this is the compromise.
Okay.
This is the political that the liberals could get out of Roberts and or Kennedy, presumably Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion, to sort of punt this thing.
Okay.
And I understand why the liberals did it. You didn't have the votes to win it now, but you had guys who didn't want to sign on to gerrymandering. And here you go. Now, again, I think the issue going forward is, well, Roberts, on any deal he made, he didn't sign on to the concurrence, obviously, because if he would have, it would have been in the majority opinion. Mm-hmm. So the question I have is, and I still don't think you can question the decision of the liberals. It's, if you push the issue, you're going to lose now. You might as well, as you said, call timeout, and we'll step back into the batter's box with next year, presumably. Yeah. But again, the reason I'm calling is because I've talked about, some people always get mad when I say this. Political institutions, these are just politicians appointed for life, which it's a bad idea. The idea of lifetime appointments is pretty clearly a bad idea.
Increasingly troublesome.
So,
all right.
I don't know where we go from here on this, but I just wanted to say I told you so.
Okay. Well, that's a fair statement. We'll start watching this over the next day or so. As there's
things that are happening today, Magnitsky Act, and
they're not happening
being
yet.
Locked up, and
yes,
and Godwin being violated, and all these things. So anyway, thanks for letting me just rant about my pet peeve. But I've talked about this for you for every year that this show has been on the air. And I could not pass this opportunity to show you what I meant, because I think everyone can understand it now.
I agree. All right. Well,
Okay.
that was breaking
All right, thank
news.
you.
We can credit you with that. Thanks very much, Armando. We'll check in with this, I'm sure, later on in the week as well. The first write-ups only now becoming available. And, of course, first one to catch my attention, the one illustrated with the photo, in the Hill. Supreme Court rules against Wisconsin Democrats in key gerrymandering case. I got the gist of what was going on. I had forgotten what was happening in the court and what we expected to come down today. But by way of background, in case you, like me, had forgotten about it, the Supreme Court on Monday, that's today, right now, as a matter of fact, ruled narrowly. That's going to be funny. They went back to the narrowly construction. Didn't you say, Armando, that it was 8-1? And where are the cries from Republicans and conservatives that this wasn't narrow? Ruled narrowly against a group of Democratic voters in Wisconsin who challenged their state's redistricting map as an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. The court said the residents lacked standing, this is really amazing actually, to bring the case forward and remanded the case back down to the lower court to give the voters an opportunity to prove they were injured by the maps, which were drawn by Republican legislators. The case, Gill v. Whitford, stems from a challenge Democratic voters brought against the redistricting of legislative districts. They argue Republicans unfairly and strategically put them at a disadvantage. And I would find it surprising if they didn't actually order or offer proof of that right from the beginning. Whether or not they found that proof persuasive is another question. But, just, I guess as briefly as possible, by way of description of exactly what is this whole standing doctrine. There is no such thing in a certain sense. There's a great body of decisions that have been made that turn on what they call standing issues, and there are different ways to come at the standing issue. And let's see, one of them that Armando mentioned is, that there really needs to be a live case or controversy. That is to say, it is court doctrine, and doctrine only. It's not, engraved in stone anywhere, but you know how they are about their precedent. They like to think it's engraved in stone. Unless they don't, from time to time. But the idea being, you can't bring us a hypothetical case. You can't say, well, if this were to happen, could we have a ruling now that would stop it so that we, don't have to waste any time making our way through the courts later on while damage is being done when we know that this thing is, imminent or coming down the pike. Or why wait for the damage to be done if it's clear what courts will do when it starts happening? But that's apparently beyond the jurisdiction of the courts, they feel. And they say we don't issue those sorts of, at least in the federal courts and at the Supreme Court level, we don't do, advisory opinions and advisory judgments. We don't get in the way of hypothetical questions. We wait for a live case or controversy that's really happening, and one in which there's some remedy that a court is permitted to award that will fix the situation. And if there isn't, then that's another way you may find yourself without standing. One, something has to have happened for real, and you have to show it that it's happening now, and it's not just that you're anticipating it happening. And they threw that one out, as Armando argued in the Affordable Care Act case, Sebelius. Two, that there has to be something a court can do to fix it. If it's just, hey, that seems wrong, but it's, beyond our ability to fix, that too can get a case dismissed on standing grounds. Three, if you are, relatedly, if you are not a person to whom that remedy can be awarded, but you have a general grievance about things, but in making it right, however the court might wish to do so, you wouldn't be the party that benefits directly from the award of that remedy. You can find yourself outside of the proper boundaries of standing as well. And in other words, if you can't show, and this, I guess this is where we're most related to the current question here. The argument is that the voters of Wisconsin, and this is really difficult to understand why they decided to rest on this one, and maybe that's also part of the problem. What they're saying here is the voters of Wisconsin cannot adequately demonstrate that by illegally or unconstitutionally, whatever the claim is, gerrymandering the legislative districts inside of Wisconsin, that you were damaged in all this. Of course, the very definition of gerrymandering is, I guess one supposedly non-political definition of gerrymandering is, well, we just drew weird districts that are non-contiguous or oddly shaped and don't represent any particular coherent group or region of the state or whatever unit it is you're subdividing here. I guess you could claim that they're just poorly drawn, irregularly shaped, or uneven in number, or unrepresentative of any particular geographic or even social strata. But more typically, of course, it stands to reason that it's drawn for political purposes, but because they're drawn by political players. For whatever reason, we've decided that it'll be our legislators that draw these maps, and maybe that was a poor idea, but it's the one we used because I guess at the time we thought, well, they'll be the people elected by the people of the state, and so therefore they'll be responsive to them. And then we forgot that there was this feedback loop whereby if you gerrymandered hard enough, you could control the elected group, the makeup of the elected group of officials that would draw the next map, who could then amplify the effect even further. And that's where we now stand. But to say that the burden of, or the harm of the gerrymandering doesn't somehow fall on Wisconsin voters seems unique, let's say, and troubling. But perhaps as Armando was saying, the roadmap is supposed to be, well, if you'll just check off these boxes and list this information, then you'll have that standing. But that sort of seems like, well, the Supreme Court, among the many powers that they have, could just simply take judicial notice that these things had been amply demonstrated and reach their conclusion. I don't know what sort of games they thought they were pulling with this idea that a deal would be made, but there you have it. Okay. It's very interesting. We'll have to watch how this thing develops over the next couple of days. In the meantime, we've talked ourselves nearly to the end of the show. Let's return to John Per's able roundup of the Magnitsky Act question, both in Canada and around the world, and the question of whether or not this is something properly applied to Trump and his family, cronies, staff, etc., and whether or not we're really in the right ballpark here. Let's see. We had just left off saying, yes, children being warehoused in cages, and when that capacity is exceeded in tent cities, does in fact perhaps bring us well into the jurisdiction of Magnitsky and similar acts around the world. As McClatchy reported, John says, the Trump administration is, of course, looking to build tent cities at military posts around Texas to shelter the increasing number of unaccompanied migrant children being held in detention. And remember, many of them did not arrive as unaccompanied migrant children. They were rendered unaccompanied migrant children by being torn from their families. The Department of Health and Human Services will visit Fort Bliss, oh, so beautifully named, Fort Bliss, a sprawling army base near El Paso in the coming weeks to look at a parcel of land where the administration is considering building a tent city to hold between 1,000 and 5,000 children, according to U.S. officials and other sources familiar with the plans. A growing coalition of immigration activists, religious leaders, political figures at all levels, and corporate CEOs even, my goodness, the real people of this country, is organizing to stop the barbaric practices of ICE and the Border Patrol. Meanwhile, the United Nations has already weighed in on what it sees as human rights abuses. And by the way, the United States withdrawing from participation in UN human rights groups, not coincidentally, though, of course, we say, oh, it's all about Israel because we love them so much. That practice amounts to arbitrary and unlawful interference in family life and is a serious violation of the rights of the child, Ravina Shamdasani, a spokeswoman for the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, based in Geneva, told reporters, the U.S. should immediately halt this practice of separating families and stop criminalizing what should be at most an administrative offense, that of irregular entry or stay in the U.S. Now, no American administration of either party would defer to the UN on border policy. Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, was no exception, declaring, neither the United Nations nor anyone else will dictate how the United States upholds its borders. Sure. But member nations who have embraced the Magnitsky framework, nations like Canada and the UK, can decide for themselves whether President Trump has committed serious human rights offenses. Very, very different, very separate from the UN. If so, his assets in those countries, assets like the Trump Tower licensing arrangement in Vancouver or that golf course in Scotland, could find themselves in a deep freeze. It's not difficult to imagine Magnitsky-style exposure for Donald Trump and his family across the wide range of political and business endeavors in which they engage. Trump's new CIA director, Gina Haspel, after all, oversaw detainee torture at a black site in Thailand and was involved in the destruction of torture tapes, which recorded almost 100 interrogations. I don't know how we got to this, but I'm glad we're on it. President Obama chose not to, quote, look backwards at the years when the Bush administration tortured some folks. Other countries might not. And as the Mueller investigation, the federal probe into Trump lawyer Michael Cohen and the web of money laundering associated with Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort proceed, the all-encompassing corruption of Donald Jr., Eric, Ivanka, and Jared Kushner may show ties between the Trump clan and some of the very people already on the Magnitsky sanctions list. And that's not an if, it's a faux show. I promise you that they had faux show got those people. I mean, that's the whole point of some of this investigation. Why were you meeting with sanctioned individuals? You were. We know it. It took you a while to admit it, but you did. And that, to return to John's conclusion here, would be very ironic indeed. After all, the Russian interference in the 2016 election, confirmed by the American intelligence leadership, has as its goal the rollback of the hardline measures taken by the Obama administration in response to Putin's Crimean invasion and incursion into Ukraine. And the subject of that June 9th, 2016 Trump Tower meeting involving Don Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner with Kremlin-linked lawyer, what was her name again? Veselnitskaya, right? Natalia Veselnitskaya, wasn't about adoptions, but about the Magnitsky Act. And again, if you're really seeking to understand what was the kernel of truth behind the lie there, it was that the Russian adoption situation was the reaction in Russia to the different use of the word adoption of the Magnitsky Act here in the United States. That would be ironic. After all, I would agree. All right. Well, now just about time to wrap things up for the day and figure out why the alarm on my phone is still so loud, despite the fact that I have lowered the volume in every possible way, but it just didn't register. Okay. Well, that's just life. And besides which, it's time to wrap things up and hand the microphones over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. And as you probably would guess, there are a million things we did not get to today that we're going to have to depend on Justice to get to for us if you want to hear about him today. Now, there's also this possibility that we might stretch things out just a wee bit over the entire remainder of the week, because there is an awful lot of the week left. We're just on Monday here. But yeah, it's also getting time for those summer vacation schedules. And remember, I'm outbound around July 4th, excitingly enough, and I'll explain to you exactly why we chose that date. It's not as unpatriotic as it might sound to leave the country on July 4th, and I'll tell you why. But time to start thinking about the fact that we'll be off the air, at least with live shows then, and I may take advantage of the quiet around here, now that I've got it, for the week, to try and record some new material for you then. But who knows whether I can keep pace with the lunacy unraveling here in the United States on an hourly basis. What's up next on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy? Rick Santorum says people who disagree with ripping away immigrant children from their parents should be doxxed. sounds fantastic. Well, Ana Navarro reminded him that it was Sunday before Mass, and he probably should have been in church at that point. On the rest of the menu for today, the number of Trump cronies who secretly met with Russians just hit 11. Ding, ding, ding. Trump uses his weekly address to squint into the camera and lie to the public about immigrants. And after the right-wing Italian government called them fake refugees and set them adrift, sound familiar? 630 children, pregnant women, and elderly in need of medical care are finally welcomed in Spain. Thank you, Spain, where they now have a socialist government. And then after his break, Trump's consumer watchdog pick to replace Mick Mulvaney draws criticism from the left and the right.
On networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show.
With David Waldman.
Well, they draw criticism from the left and the right, both sides. Washington is broken, we'll just have to leave it there. What about around the world? Nobody but nobody, he says, is protecting India's bravest journalists. And you want to find out about what that's all about and how it's happening? Stay tuned next, right here on Netroots Radio.